Oh yeah, so okay, so you do a lot of writing.
Yes.
As I said before, I'm really interested in this idea of accessible art, but art in the sense that it's like it infuses everything and kind of anything. Would you call yourself an artist?
Yes.
Or would you call yourself a writer? Or like what term would you think and use?
So I would call myself a writer simply because I think anyone who writes with intention can and should call themselves a writer. Artist also, yes, but not because I write, but because I try very hard to approach like my everyday life with intention. And I think the key to like art in general is whether or not you approach it with intention. I think intention is the only difference between making art and not making art.
Yeah.
And that's
I'm so excited that you use that word.
Yeah.
Because it's so validating, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like, this is why I want to have conversations with people like this, like really get at like how we all describe art and like how we all describe life and like.
No, it's.
You know what I mean?
It's the best.
And like that's what I like about the accessibility of understanding art like that, because it's like you're already an artist.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we need to like democratize the word, because it's just it's getting to the point where people are very like shy about saying like, oh, like I'm an artist, because it's like, oh my god, like I'm an artist.
Yeah,
it's like it doesn't have to be that way. And I think it shouldn't be that way. I think it's better if it's not. So for me, writing, well, my relationship with writing has evolved a lot. When you're younger, you just think like writing is a way that I can express myself, you know, like I've got all these feelings and what am I gonna do? I'm gonna write about them. And for a while, like in my teen years, which have only just recently ended, it was definitely a way for me to understand myself and to understand my way of being in the world and to understand events that happened that would not have otherwise made sense unless I was forced to like write sentences about them. But I do think that now I'm much more interested in understanding other people and sort of these impossible circumstances that we're all at one point in, and what happens sort of on the internal side, because the intersubjectivity is impossible. Like you will never actually be able to inhabit the brain space of another person. But writing to me is the art form, again for me, that gives me the closest thing to being able to inhabit someone else's brain space. Yeah, does that make sense? Like,
yeah, I think so. I think I find that a lot, that like I'll be talking to someone just generally, or talking about art, or watching a piece of art, and like I understand that there's some kind of communication that's kind of going on there, but at least I feel there's so much like you have to do mediation. There is mediation on it. You know?
I think it's less like that I'll write something and someone will read it and then I'm inhabiting their brain space, but like by like having my words enter their mind. More that like when like in the act of writing, I am actively trying to understand circumstances I've never like lived in. So it's more like on the writing side of things than the reading side of things. Like the impact that a piece of writing has on a reader after it's been written is like so out of your control. And I really think that a lot of the time we forget that the act of doing the art is just as important and necessary to like understand the benefits and harms that are happening in that moment, like when you're making the thing and not just when it's being received. And it's, again, it's like, for me, it's very much a way of arriving at an understanding of like other people living other lives. Like the most recent story I wrote was about like a young woman who has an affair with like an older man, and then they end up together, and she develops very like strong maternal feelings for his son, and the relationship between the young girl and the older man ends up falling apart, but she has these strong maternal feelings towards the son such that she stays in the relationship because of this connection she has to the child. And like that's a circumstance I'm not in, and I've never been in, and ideally would never find myself in, but wow, that, I mean, that has to have happened to someone, right? Like that, these kinds of choices. And like I can empathize with that character and like having to make decisions about when you stay and when you leave, and so that's like one way in which there's this weird intersubjectivity between me and like a fictional thing. And then there's also just spending the time trying to understand how any of us do any of the things we do, you know. It just it blows my mind every time I think about the fact that everyone is constantly running through their own narrative.
Totally.
Like,
totally.
Yeah.
I have a friend, so like we're anthropologists, and I have a friend who, you're anthropology and English, but I have a friend who does a lot of English criticism and a lot of film criticism, and he says that the great thing about art is that it creates a containable world that we can understand.
Yeah, exactly.
And I can't tell if there's a tension there in terms of anthropology and art, anthropology versus art, because anthropology is trying to understand the world,
the phenomena, rather than the individual case,
as opposed to like a created phenomena that we can, you know, sort of analyze and I'm interested in this a lot too. I took gender and queer theory last quarter with Cyan Nye, which was amazing, and a lot of theorists who are trying to make statements about gender identity or sexuality will use fiction as their example rather than like scientific evidence, and that was something that I'd never been exposed to before that I found very interesting. The fact that like these not factually real situations were used as like a microscopic, that is interesting,
like case of being alive, and that you can understand it better when it's presented to you that way. Yeah, it was very weird to see like an Anne Beattie story used as evidence. Yeah. You know, but why not? I mean, what?
And it's, I mean, it's the same in anthropology where it's like there's kind of this literary turn recently and like a more creative turn, and people trying to communicate in a different way, you know what I mean? Which
I'm all for, actually. I mean, I think part of the reason I was drawn to anthropology and not sociology or psychology or economics is because anthropology is highly aware of the fact that it's human beings studying other humans, and I much prefer that to the idea that we are like perfect eyes studying humans, you know. Like, I like the idea that anthropology is always messy and it will never not be messy, and so this turn towards more creative work in anthropology I think is just reflective of the fact that we're becoming more and more comfortable with the fact that like if I'm an anthropologist in the field, I'm still like a human with a very complicated like set of ideas that will inherently influence everything I do, no matter how objective I try to be. Like, I like the idea of just rejecting the possibility of objectivity, because I don't think, like, at least in my worldview, I can't imagine circumstances under which a human being could be 100% objective. So, how do my stories come out? This is like the big question, and if I were like a fancy writer, which I am not, I would be like really elusive and be like, oh, like they just pour out of me naturally, like, which always frustrates me, because when you see interviews with writers, they always say like, there's no process, but there is. For me, it's usually I have an ending almost always before I have a beginning or a middle. Yeah, I always arrive at the end. I'm not always, but the vast majority of the time when I approach a story, it's because I have an image of where one person or two people end up, and then I want to understand how they got there. And then sometimes I'll either give myself an arbitrary starting point and then just fill in the meat of the story up to that ending, or sometimes I'll see something or experience something that will give me sort of like the center, and then you have the center and the ending, and then that will give you a hint to where the beginning is. But it's almost always like a backwards art, like where I'm trying to fill in the blanks up to the present rather than I'm starting at a point and I'm moving forward. I really wish I could be very scheduled about my approach to art, because I really respect people with like that kind of mental creative discipline where they can say to themselves like, today I'm writing this part of the story and like that is what's going to happen. For me, it's about 85% sitting, getting over caffeinated and thinking and like having existential crises or like crises about my characters, and then 15% actually writing once I've arrived at that point. And so like, yes, I will say to myself like, today we're going to think about like why this happened in this way, but the writing will happen completely out of order, and I don't think I've ever written a story from start to finish, for example. Like, I think it's always like patched together in the process.
Yeah.
Which I don't know what that says about me as a person, but that is what it is in terms of the process. I've thought about this a lot, actually, because I was very closely connected with someone for about 2 years who, in a way that I completely admire, and I mean this like in all honesty, not me being like, oh, like I admire it, but he knows exactly what his calling is. He knows exactly what he wants to do with his life. He knows the exact steps to achieving that life. He knows what he needs to be happy. Like he does not have the question that I'm like asking myself right now. And he will get there, and he will arrive at this point that he knows he wants to arrive at, and he will be genuinely content and gratified and joyful throughout his life because he just knows. And I mean, there is a huge part of me that envies that. It would be so nice to be able to just say, like, I know what my point B is, and I know that when I arrive there I'm not going to question whether or not I should have been at point L, you know, like, but that's just, I mean, you don't get to choose, right? I mean, you can try, and I mean, for a while I tried very hard to figure that out for myself, like, but I don't know. Yeah, I wonder how this is related to the art thing, because I don't think I know anyone who would call themselves an artist who doesn't wrestle with where they're going pretty much on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And so maybe part of it is just being... Yeah.
And it is interesting, because it's like, it's not so much, at least for now, thankfully, it's not so much a question of like, how am I going to get a job and be an artist? It's kind of like, how am I going to live today? How am I going to live tomorrow?
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. And I think one thing I've really liked about being in Paris, even just for like a week and a half, is that the French, as my French teacher told us yesterday in class, your identity is not super tied to your job. Like, in America, the first thing we will ask is like, so like, what do you do? And the answer is like, oh, I'm a lawyer, like I'm whatever I do. And I didn't realize it was that way until I came here, and people, I mean, your job is what you do, but it's not who you are, and like, it's not even the majority of what you do, because French people don't work as much as us. And I think that's really liberating, because it means that you can be an artist, and like, if you need to do something to support yourself, that doesn't mean you're not being honest to like the way you need to live your life. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
and,
it
like,
totally makes sense.
I really struggle with that at home, because I know, so that's one thing, I think.
And like, exactly what you're saying, it's like, when you can like think about different lifestyles like that, it's kind of a release and a comfort, because you don't have to think of yourself as like, unless I have this art piece in the MoMA, or in this editorial, then like, I'm not an artist.
Exactly.
You know? Whereas it's like how do I make my life art? You know what I mean?
Exactly. And how do I live a good life? Like this is another one of the things I really appreciate about being in Europe, is that I think in America, artists in particular, but just everyone is very possessed by this idea of like capital G greatness. Like, how can I be a great writer, like the great American novel, or just like great, everything in America we would like to be like the best or the greatest. And in Europe, I think they are much more concerned with living a good life, like the good life. Like, what does that mean for an individual to live a good life, or even a grand life, but not to be preoccupied with this pretty much unattainable idea of greatness that we have in America. And that has brought me so much joy to think about my own life that way. Like how can I just live in a way that feels good and does good, and is not always striving for something that is so far ahead that, like, I mean, a lot of it is out of your control, you know? And that's been like a very liberating way to think about living.